Start. The case of State of West Bengal versus the Committee for Protection of Democratic Rights presents challenging questions to Indian constitutional law jurisprudence with regard to the power of the judiciary vis-a-vis other organs of the state. It is a landmark judgment where the Supreme Court held that a High Court can direct the Central Bureau of Investigation within bracket hereinafter CBI to investigate an offence without the consent of the state government within whose territorial jurisdiction the offence is alleged to have taken place. This power is clearly an executive one and is one that has been expressly denied to the Parliament. Thus, while the petitioner argued relying on the doctrine of separation of powers and the federal setup envisaged under the Indian Constitution, the court rebutted the petitioner by using its power of judicial review. Thus, the case presents an interesting battle between the legislature, executive, and judiciary, bringing the scope of judicial power under examination. This case comment argues that while the conclusion of the Supreme Court is correct, the court has failed to give cogent reasoning to support its decision. Para. The court, in its judgment, basically placed one basic feature of the Constitution, judicial review, against the other two which had been put forth by the petitioner. The comment argues that instead of using the power of judicial review as a trump card, the court should have addressed the constitutional and legal issues arising in the matter to objectively analyze the scope of its powers. The critic firstly describes the background of the case, giving in brief its facts and judgment. Next, it examines whether the basic structure doctrine has been correctly applied by the court. Thirdly, it examines the scope of the powers of the High Court in the light of the federal setup of the Indian Constitution and the doctrine of separation of powers. On the basis of the analysis, this critic highlights the flaws and implications of the court's reasoning and suggests the approach that it should have adopted instead. Para. In State of West Bengal versus the Committee for Protection of Democratic Rights, a 5-judge bench of the Apex Court was called upon to decide whether the High Court under Article 226 of the Constitution of India can direct the CBI established under the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act 1946 to investigate an offence alleged to have taken place within the territorial jurisdiction of a state without the consent of the state government. The question arose when the Calcutta High Court directed the CBI to take up investigation in a case where 11 members of a political party in West Bengal were killed and grave allegations were made against the ruling party. After discovering serious lapses and inadequacies in the investigation, even after more than 3 months from the date of the incident, the High Court concluded that a strong suspicion might arise as to the fairness of investigation by the state police and hence handed over the investigation to the CBI. To challenge this direction, the petitioner approached the Supreme Court, where the matter was eventually placed before a constitutional bench. Para. The petitioner put forth an argument based on two basic features of the Indian Constitution, that's federal setup and separation of powers. As per constitutional and statutory provisions, the state legislature has jurisdiction over police matters and the parliament cannot encroach upon it without the consent of the concerned state government. It was argued that these restrictions over the powers of the parliament, reflective of our federal setup, extend also to the judiciary, barring the courts from directing the police of one state to investigate an offence in another state without its consent. As such, a direction would be in breach of the federal setup envisaged by the Constitution. It was further argued that the separation of powers doctrine prevents the courts from exercising the executive power of directing the police force of one state to carry out investigations in another without the latter's consent. Even in situations where the investigations are not carried out impartially, the judiciary should leave the matter to the wisdom of the parliament to enact an appropriate legislation. In short, the petitioner argued that the impugned direction of the High Court is violative of the federal structure and separation of powers doctrine, both of which are basic features of the Constitution. Para. The Supreme Court rejected the petitioner's arguments and concluded that a direction by the High Court under Article 226 of the Constitution to the CBI to investigate an offence committed within the territory of a state without the consent of that state will neither impinge upon the federal structure of the Constitution nor violate the doctrine of separation of powers and shall be valid in law. The court held that judicial review itself being a basic feature, while exercising powers under Articles 32 and 226, the courts are merely discharging their duties and not violating the federal setup or the separation of powers doctrine. Stop.